Imagine standing outside a courthouse, just moments before one of the most important trials of your career. You've worked your whole life for this moment, your heart steady but strong, your confidence hard-earned. Now picture two uniformed police officers approaching you not with respect, not with courtesy, but with suspicion in their eyes. And before you can even explain who you are, they try to put handcuffs on your wrists. That's exactly what happened to Judge Maya Carter. A brilliant black woman whose sharp mind and unshakable sense of justice had already earned her a place on the bench. But to those officers, blinded by arrogance and prejudice, she looked like nothing more than someone to control. What they didn't realize was that Maya wasn't just anyone standing outside that courthouse. She was the very judge assigned to hear their case inside that very building. Maya's journey to this moment hadn't been easy. Growing up, she had learned early what it meant to be underestimated. People often judged her by her skin color, her gender, or her quiet strength. But each slight and every act of prejudice only fueled her determination. She graduated at the top of her class, passed the bar on her first attempt, and gained a reputation as a fair but fearless attorney. When she was appointed judge, she vowed to never forget her roots or the countless others who were silenced or dismissed because of who they were. That morning, Maya had walked to the courthouse without the usual entourage, preferring to keep a low profile. She wore a simple black suit, her robe neatly folded over her arm, ready to preside over the day's trial. But as she waited by the steps, two officers spotted her. Their eyes narrowed, and instead of greeting her respectfully, they exchanged a smirk. "Ma'am, you can't loiter here," one of them barked. Maya opened her mouth to explain, but before she could get a word out, the second officer stepped forward. "Hands where we can see them." Confused, Maya tried to tell them she was due in court, but the officers didn't listen. One reached for her arm, his grip rough and impatient. And then, in front of the crowd gathering around, he pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Gasps erupted from the bystanders. Some whispered. Others raised their phones to record. Maya's calm demeanor only seemed to fuel the officer's aggression, as though her quiet refusal to panic was some sort of defiance. Inside, Maya's heart pounded, but not from fear. She had faced men like this before, men who thought authority gave them the right to demean others. What they didn't know was that in just a few minutes, those same men would have to stand before her bench. She was their judge, the one with the power to decide their fate. The moment the cuffs clicked around her wrists, the twist of destiny had already begun to unfold. The officers, smug and careless, dragged her toward the entrance of the courthouse. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, and one voice cut through. "That's Judge Carter." The officers froze for a split second, scoffing as if it were a joke. But Maya lifted her chin, her voice clear and unwavering. "Yes," she said, "and today, gentlemen, I am your judge." The silence that followed was deafening. The officers exchanged panicked glances, suddenly realizing the magnitude of their mistake. The very system they thought they controlled had turned on them in the most humiliating way possible. The gavel had not yet struck, but the lesson was already echoing. Respect, dignity, and justice were not negotiable. This was only the beginning of what would become one of the most unforgettable days inside that courtroom. And as you'll soon see, what happened next left the entire city talking. The heavy courthouse doors swung open as Judge Maya Carter was marched inside, the cold steel cuffs still biting into her wrists. The officers kept their hands on her arms as if parading her for the world to see. But the world was already watching. Spectators, reporters, the courthouse staff froze in shock as they realized who she was. Whispered voices filled the hall. "Is that Judge Carter? What are they doing?" The irony was unbearable. Maya, who had devoted her life to upholding the law, was now being paraded like a criminal through the very halls where her gavel usually struck. But instead of shouting or begging for release, she walked with her head high, her gaze steady. She knew something the officers didn't. Justice has a way of turning the tables. By the time they shoved open the courtroom door, the room was already buzzing. Attorneys, clerks, and even the jury pool looked on in disbelief. The presiding bailiff nearly dropped his clipboard when he saw the cuffs on her wrists. "What in God's name is going on here?" he demanded, rushing forward. One of the officers smirked, tightening his grip on Maya's arm. "Caught her loitering outside. Figured we'd bring her in for questioning." The bailiff's face turned pale, his eyes darting between the officers and Maya. "Do you have any idea who this is?" he asked, his voice trembling. The officers exchanged a dismissive glance. Yeah, some troublemaker pretending to be important. That was when Maya finally spoke. Her voice calm, even regal despite the humiliation. Gentlemen, I don't need to pretend.
I am Judge Maya Carter.
And you just dragged your presiding judge into her own courtroom in handcuffs. The silence that followed was unlike anything the courtroom had ever heard. Every attorney, clerk, and juror seemed frozen in place. The officer's smug grin slipped into looks of horror. One even stumbled back a step, his hands still clutching the cuffs as if they burned him. The bailiff immediately barked, "Remove those cuffs!" Now his voice echoed like a thunderclap. The officers fumbled with the keys, their hands shaking. The metallic clink of the cuffs being undone rang out louder than any gavel. Maya rubbed her wrists gently, not in anger, but in measured patience, as though she had already decided how this would play out. But instead of storming out or demanding their arrest on the spot, Maya calmly walked past them. She stepped onto the bench, placed her robe over her shoulders, and sat down in her chair, with the authority of a queen reclaiming her throne. She lifted the gavel, banged it once, and said firmly, "Court is now in session." The two officers stood frozen in front of the courtroom, pale and sweating. Realizing they were not only standing trial today, they were standing trial in front of the woman they had just tried to humiliate. Maya leaned forward slightly, her eyes piercing into theirs. "Officers," she said, her voice steady, "it seems fate has given us an unusual arrangement. You are here for misconduct charges, and now your behavior this morning will become part of the record." The entire courtroom held its breath. The officers had no words, no excuses. Their arrogance had turned to fear in a matter of minutes. And Maya? She had just turned her own humiliation into the most powerful statement of her career. That dignity and justice cannot be shackled. The trial had only just begun, but everyone knew it would be unlike any they had ever witnessed. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Judge Maya Carter sat tall behind the bench, her robe flowing around her like armor.
Ow.
The two officers stood frozen, their faces drained of color, sweat glistening on their foreheads under the fluorescent lights. The murmurs in the room swelled attorneys, whispering to one another. Jurors exchanging wide-eyed glances, and spectators craning their necks as if they were about to witness history. "Officers," Maya said, her tone cutting through the noise like a blade. "Step forward." The men hesitated, their boots suddenly heavy. One shifted nervously, his voice cracking as he tried to speak. "Your Honor, it was a misunderstanding. We didn't know." Maya lifted her hand, silencing him with a single gesture. "What you didn't know is not an excuse for what you did." She leaned forward, her eyes sharp, unflinching. "You saw a woman outside a courthouse. You didn't ask questions. You didn't check identification. You used force, and worse, you mocked her. That woman happened to be me. But it could have been anyone." Her words landed like hammers. The room was utterly silent. Even the sound of someone clearing their throat felt out of place. "Tell me," she continued, her voice softer now but weighted with authority. "Would you have done the same if I were a man in a suit? Or was it easier to assume a black woman standing outside was suspicious?" The officers exchanged nervous glances. One stammered, "No, Your Honor. We didn't mean intent," Maya interrupted firmly. "Doesn't erase impact. The law does not bend for arrogance. Neither do I at that moment." The defense attorney, who had been preparing to argue against these very officers, rose from his chair. "Your Honor," he said cautiously, "given what just happened, I move that this incident be entered into evidence as a live demonstration of the defendant's conduct." The courtroom gasped. Even the prosecutor, who had been quietly observing, nodded in agreement. Maya's gavel struck once, sharp and final. Motion granted. The officers' shoulders slumped, the weight of the moment crushing them. They had walked into court thinking they were in control, and now their own actions had become the clearest evidence of their guilt. But Maya wasn't finished. She straightened her robe and addressed the entire room. "Let today serve as a reminder. Authority is not a weapon. It is a responsibility, and those who forget that will answer to justice." The jury leaned forward, hanging on her every word. Reporters scribbled furiously. The two officers looked like men standing on the edge of a cliff, with no ground left beneath them. The trial was still underway, but everyone already sensed the outcome. The humiliation they had tried to inflict on Judge Carter had only exposed their own corruption, and now the entire courtroom was watching their downfall. The tension in the courtroom reached its breaking point. Judge Maya Carter sat still for a long moment, her eyes scanning every face before her. She could feel the weight of history pressing down. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been judged unfairly for how they looked. She took a slow breath, her voice steady, but laced with emotion. When I stood outside that courthouse, I was just Maya Carter. A woman. A citizen. I wasn't wearing this robe, wasn't holding this gavel. I was simply a person who deserved respect. But in that moment, I was treated like less. Not because of what I did, but because of who I am. Her words struck deep. You could hear sniffles in the audience. Even a few jurors wiped their eyes, visibly moved. She turned her gaze back to the two officers. You mocked me. You tried to strip away my dignity. And when you realized who I was, only then did you feel shame. But shame that comes from being caught is not the same as remorse. The younger officer's lips trembled, his voice weak. We're sorry, Your Honor. We didn't mean for it to go that far. Maya shook her head. Sorry isn't enough when trust is broken. You were sworn to protect, but what you did was abuse. Abuse of power, abuse of position, abuse of another human being. Her gavel came down once, echoing like thunder. This court finds that both officers acted with prejudice and unlawful force. Their credibility is compromised. Their testimony in this case is void. Gasps filled the room. The entire prosecution's argument, built on the testimony of those officers, crumbled in an instant. But Maya wasn't done. She leaned closer, her tone now softer, carrying the weight of her heart. Justice is not just about punishment. It is about change. So here is my sentence. Both officers are hereby suspended without pay pending further investigation. They will undergo mandatory bias and sensitivity training. In this case, will serve as a precedent that no officer, no matter their badge, is above accountability. The room erupted not in chaos, but in applause. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras flashed, and the two officers stood there stunned, knowing their careers had just been shattered by their own arrogance. Judge Carter rose to her feet. For a moment, she let herself feel the sting of what had happened outside that courthouse. But now, in this room, she stood taller than ever. It's not just as a judge, but as a symbol of justice itself. She raised her gavel one final time. The court is adjourned. The sound was like a drumbeat of victory. The courtroom doors opened, and people rose to their feet not for the officers, but for her. For Maya Carter, the judge who turned humiliation into history and pain into power. And as she walked out, she knew this story would echo far beyond these walls. It was more than her victory, it was a message to every person who had ever been underestimated. Because sometimes, the ones they try to silence end up delivering the loudest verdict. If this story moved you, don't just let it end here. Share it. Let others feel it. And subscribe for more true stories of justice, resilience, and triumph.